When discussing how states come to be, it's often less a discussion of the history of a physical location and more a discussion of where lines became drawn and who took control of the area between those lines. The first European contact with what is now the state of Oregon came when a Spanish exploration team led by Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo first saw the coast in 1543 during the ongoing search for a northwest passage from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Although Spain had then claimed the land, Oregon and much of the northwest Pacific coast reigned largely without any Spanish influence or settlement for the next 200 years. The Spanish began to hear rumors that Russian and English explorers were traveling to the northwest and making claims on land in the area. Starting in 1774, a series of Spanish expeditions went to the area, but they didn't establish any permanent settlements. In 1778, a British explorer named James Cook once again took up the search for the Northwest Passage, but instead found opportunities for fur trading with the Native Americans of the region. In 1788, an American captain by the name of Robert Gray entered into the mouth of the Columbia River in what is now Tillamook Bay. In 1790, Spain, having no settlements or any real control in the area, conceded exclusive ownerships to avoid war. In 1792, George Vancouver, a British commander, claimed the area around Puget Sound for Britain. In 1799, the Russian imperial government established the Russian-American Company in efforts to acquire land in the Pacific Northwest, but they were largely unsuccessful outside of what is now Alaska. Between 1805 and 1806, Lewis and Clark set out to explore the land that had been newly acquired as part of the Louisiana Purchase. They continued well beyond the outside of that territory, all the way into Oregon and the mouth of the Columbia River. There they built an encampment to stay for the winter, but they did not make it a permanent settlement, turning it over to the Native Americans before returning east. In 1807, a Canadian fur trader named David Thompson mapped and explored much of the area and referred to it as the Columbia District. Thompson used these maps to claim the area for the British through the Northwest Company that he worked for. During that same year, the United States Congress passed a general embargo that closed off trade to Canada. John Jacob Astor had made his fortune in the fur trade, exporting fur from Montreal through New York to Europe. This law change more or less cut off his Canadian fur supply. Fortunately for Astor, he had recently expanded into cross-Pacific trade with China, primarily in opium, so he had some West Coast resources available as he was looking for new fur resources outside of Canada. In 1808, Astor established the American Fur Company. Sometime around 1810, Astor sent one of his Chinese-born ships, a 290-ton merchant ship called the Tonquin, to set sail from New York City to sail around Cape Horn in South America and eventually arrive in the Pacific Northwest to establish a fort at the mouth of the Columbia River, near where Lewis and Clark had landed. But severe weather forced them to stop in the Falkland Islands for repairs, and the captain nearly left 8 men behind before being threatened with mutiny. Tensions continued as the ship sailed around South America, and during a stop in Hawaii, several men attempted to abandon the ship, but were brought back by local Hawaii authorities. One of the men was flogged and another was put in chains, but the ship was also able to recruit 24 native Hawaiians for the expedition. On March 22, 1811, the ship arrived at the mouth of the Columbia River, but 8 men died trying to find a way to navigate to shore before eventually laying anchor at Baker Bay and proceeding 15 miles up the Columbia River, where they began construction on Fort Astoria, very near where Lewis and Clark had built their fortification years prior. This was the first American-owned permanent settlement on the Pacific, and Astor intended it to become, quote, an emporium of the West. After unloading the materials and crew who were there to build the fortification, the remaining crew of the Tonquin left the bay to sail north to trade with local Native American groups near the Quaquet Sound. On June 14, 1811, a chief of the Tolokiat tribe came on board to trade pelts. The captain of the Tonquin insulted the chief by tossing the pelts when he was unhappy with the price offered. The chief left, and a native woman came aboard the ship that night to warn the captain that they had planned to attack the ship the following day because they had been insulted. The captain ignored the warning and allowed 20 men to board the ship the following day, despite another 20 following close behind them. They offered the captain good deals, and he allowed the men on board, despite being specifically warned against allowing too many outsiders onto the ship at one time. At some point, a signal was given, and the Tolokiat attacked. The captain and several other men were killed almost immediately. Some of the crew were able to hold off the attackers from below as they had firearms there, and the Tolokiat withdrew as night fell, leaving just 5 survivors, one of whom was seriously injured. Knowing they didn't have enough men to sail the large ship, the 4 men who were able escaped using a rowboat, intended to go back to Fort Astoria for help. The wounded man remained on the ship. When the Tolokiat returned the next day to plunder the ship, the wounded crewman lit a store of black powder on the ship, causing a massive explosion that killed between 60 and 200 Tolokiat, depending on the account. The 4 men who had tried to escape by rowboat were captured. 3 of the men were then reportedly tortured to death. The 4th was allowed to live as he was a half-Chinook translator, and was aided by the Chinook in returning to Fort Astoria. The loss of the Tonquin was also the loss of a huge amount of food and supplies that those left behind at Fort Astoria had planned to use both for trade and to survive through the winter. The idea of setting up an emporium became the idea of trying to figure out how to survive, particularly as an overland group also arrived during the winter. But things improved in May when a supply ship arrived, and by the summer they were ready to receive guests. This was when a Native American by the name of Cockstock Núpika and their wife arrived at the camp. Cockstock had been traveling the area acting as a courier and guide to fur trappers and traders, and was also seen as a prophetic figure, warning of a coming plague of disease to this area to the local natives. These prophecies had led to a falling out with local native groups, and apparently Knoxville came to the fort seeking some kind of asylum in exchange for knowledge of the area and skills as a translator. About a month later, previously mentioned Canadian explorer David Thompson happened to arrive at the fort, also seeking shelter. He had encountered Knoxville prior during his travels, first when they were taken as a second wife by one of his men. This was likely when Knoxville learned English, and possibly also the dangers of disease from European settlers. Thompson would write of Knoxville, quote, that she became so common that I had to send her to her relations, as all the Indian men are married. A courtesan is neglected by the men and hated by the women. He described Cockstock by saying, quote, she had set herself up for a prophetess and gradually had gained, by her shrewdness, some influence among the natives as a dreamer, an expounder of dreams. She recollected me before I did her, and gave a haughty look of defiance, as much to say, I am now out of your power. Thompson wrote that his first impression on seeing Cockstock again, before he was able to realize it was the same person he had met prior, was, quote, apparently a young man, well dressed in leather, carrying a bow and quiver of arrows, with his wife, a young woman in good clothing. Those at Fort Astor suspected both were spies for the British Northwest Company, but they still welcomed all the new information. The fort was also so far removed from communication that Thompson thought the two companies perhaps had actually aligned, as when he left, the Northwest Company was buying shares of Pacific Fur. Visitors moved on before the winter of 1812 came, but American control of the fort was still short-lived. When the War of 1812 broke out, Astor had no hopes that any military protection would come, and so he sold the fort to the British. When a British ship arrived in December of 1813, the captain wrote, quote, is this the fort about which I have heard so much talking? Damn me, but I'd batter it down in 2 hours with a 4-pounder. The British captain then renamed the fort Fort George after the monarch the Americans fought a revolution against, who was still the king. But the British across their Canadian territories were having difficulties even making agreements amongst themselves. Conflicts between the two British-owned fur trading companies, the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, reached the point where an armed conflict broke out. The fight between the companies, known as the Pemmican War, led them to have very little interest in pressing another conflict with the United States over land that neither had much control over. In 1818, England and the United States signed a treaty that allowed for the joint occupation of what the Americans called Oregon Country and the British called the Columbia District. It established the 49th parallel east of the Continental Divide as the boundary line for British and Canadian holdings for the next 10 years. Indigenous claims were more or less ignored, despite them having occupied the area for an estimated 16,000 years. In 1819, Spain conceded the land north of the 42nd parallel in the Adams-Honest Treaty. In 1825, the British and the Russians agreed that Russia could have the land above the 54th parallel at the 40 degrees north, or more or less what is now modern Alaska. As the 10-year shared land agreement between the United States and England began to come to an end, negotiations continued but little progress was made, and so it was renewed in 1827. In the time that had passed, the rival British companies had merged, and they were actively discouraging settlement by Americans in the land, but they weren't doing anything to risk the treaty or war. In 1828, after reading about the Lewis and Clark expedition, a man by the name of Hall J. Kelly began working to organize groups to travel from New England to Oregon, either by land or sea. He convinced the Massachusetts state legislature to charter a society to promote the settlement along the Columbia River and began publishing maps of the area to increase interest. He was able to convince a businessman by the name of Nathaniel Jarvis Wythe that Oregon had commercial promise, but when Kelly took so long to form an expedition, Wythe decided to create his own. Wythe wrote in his journal, quote, on March 10, 1832, I left Boston in a vessel with 20 men for Baltimore, where I was joined by 4 more. And on the 27th, left a railroad for Frederick, Maryland, and from thence to Brownsville we marched on foot and took passage from that place to Liberty, Missouri, on various steamboats, which place we left for the prairies on 12 May with 21 men, 3 having deserted, and on 27 May 3 more deserted. His party joined with a fur trader who had been to the Oregon Territory in the past, in Independence, Missouri, and the group traveled what would come to be known as the Oregon Trail all the way to the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Wyeth wrote of the area, quote, I have never seen country of equal beauty except the Kansas country, and I doubt not will one day sustain a large population. If this country is ever colonized, this is the point to commence. Wyeth returned to Boston in 1834, began recruiting for a new, larger expedition with plans to set up trading posts and fisheries in the area. In addition to those traveling for business, was a group led by a missionary by the name of Jason Lee. Lee had read an account of 4 Native Americans who had traveled from Oregon to St. Louis asking for someone to bring, quote, the Book of Heaven to their people. This account was published in the Christian Advocate and Journal. On reading of the account, Wilbur Fisk, president of Wesleyan University, called for the Methodist Church to go on a mission to preach to the native people of the areas. Lee, being a former student of Fisk, volunteered along with his nephew Daniel. On arrival to the Willamette Valley, Lee found that the prophecy of disease made decades before at Fort Astoria was coming true. He wrote of the spread of disease among the natives that were now for the first time in regular contact with Europeans. Quote, unless the God of heaven undertake their cause, they must perish off the face of the earth, and their name blotted out from under heaven. Still, Lee believed the land itself was ripe for settlement, and wrote back encouraging more settlers to follow him. In 1835, a man by the name of Marcus Whitman traveled to what is now northwestern Montana to minister to the native people of that area. He had been trained in medicine as an apprentice, but his primary goal had always been to become a minister. Marcus had previously crossed the Rocky Mountains with the assistance of a fellow missionary by the name of Samuel Parker, and sought to return. Parker and Whitman had met with the members of the Cayuse Nation, and had reportedly made the following offer to them in exchange for Whitman being able to set up a mission. Parker had said, quote, I do not intend to take your lands for nothing. After the doctor has come, there will come every year a big ship loaded with goods to be divided among the Indians. Those goods will not be sold, but given to you. The missionaries will bring you plows and hoes to teach you how to cultivate the land. They will not sell, but give them to you. After returning to Montana, Whitman had met a woman by the name of Narcissa Prentice, a teacher who had been hoping to travel to Oregon, but had not been permitted by traveling groups to cross the Rockies as she was a single woman. The two married, and they joined with a group that included another married couple engaged in missionary work by the name of Henry and Eliza Spalding. As part of this group, Eliza and Narcissa became the first known European American women to cross the Rockies. The Cayuse allowed construction of the mission as agreed, but in the summer of 1837 they came seeking the promised payments. Whitman refused. The next winter, the leader of the Cayuse, a man by the name of Toakate, came again asking for both payment and medicine for his ill wife. When Whitman refused, Toakate reportedly said, quote, Doctor, you have come here to give us bad medicines. You come to kill us, and you steal our lands. You had promised to pay me every year, and you have given me nothing. You had better go away. If my wife dies, you shall die also. His wife lived, but a tense impasse continued. By 1840, other missionaries had come, and farmland was expanded. A missionary farmer began poisoning some melons to discourage Cayuse theft, only telling the fellow missionaries which ones were tainted. Although some Cayuse became sick as a result, no deaths occurred. By this point, the mission had become a regular stop on the Oregon Trail. Narcissa wrote, quote, a tide of immigration appears to be moving this way rapidly. What a few years will bring we know not. A great change has taken place even since we first entered the country, and we have a reason to believe it will stop here. Instead of 2 lonely American females, we now number 14, and soon may 20 or more, if reports are true. We are emphatically situated on the highway between the states and the Columbia River, and we are a testing place for the weary travelers. Consequently, a greater burden rests upon us than upon any of our associates to be always ready. She wrote to her mother that the Cayuse, quote, are so filthy that they make a good deal of cleaning wherever they go, and this wears out a woman very fast. We must clean after them, for we have come to elevate them and not to suffer ourselves to sink to their standard. With regards to worshiping with the Cayuse, which was presumably the intent of the mission, she wrote, quote, we told them our house was to live in, and we could not have them worship there, for they would make it so dirty and fill it so full of fleas that we could not live in it. We said to make them further that they did not help us to build it, and that the people in other places built the houses of worship and did not let one man do it all alone, and urged them to join together by and by to build one for themselves of adobe. But it was no avail to them. They murmured still and said we must pay them for their land we lived on. In 1841, Toakate brought horses to graze in Whitman's cornfield. Whitman wrote that Toakate said, quote, that this was his land, that he grew up here, and that the horses were only eating up the growth of the soil, and demanded of me what I had ever paid him for the land. After this, Whitman wrote that he would never give the Cayuse anything. The Whitmans were not the only missionaries in the area, and often complained of being in competition with Catholic missionaries, who had baptized some of the leaders of the Cayuse. When those early Catholic missionaries moved away, Whitman said to those who had been baptized that they were, quote, lost, ruined, and condemned state, in order to remove the hope that worshiping will save them. This reportedly angered those who had been baptized and increased tensions even more. In early 1846, missionaries associated with Whitman had put out poisoned meat to kill wolves in the area, but some Cayuse ate the meat and became ill. Tonquin reportedly said that if any of his people had died, he would have killed the man who left the meat. Reportedly, Whitman laughed when he heard this later. During the summer of 1847, a measles outbreak occurred, devastating the native groups in the area who had no prior exposure to the disease. Estimates are that nearly half of all the Cayuse in the area died during the outbreak, including the majority of all of their children. All of these points of tension came to a head on November 29, 1849, when, after a rumor was spread, possibly by a disgruntled half-Iroquois man who recently arrived at the mission, that Whitman was intentionally poisoning the Cayuse rather than treating them with the medicine he was providing. Believing this to be true, a group of Cayuse came to the mission pretending to seek medical treatment, and when allowed inside, attacked Whitman and the other missionaries. A witness wrote, Tonquin chopped the doctor's face so badly that his features could not be recognized. Narcissa was shot and killed during the initial attack, along with either 11 or 12 other missionaries, and 54 missionaries were taken captive by the Cayuse and held for ransom. 5 died in captivity, most likely of disease. On December 29th, a ransom was paid for the 49 remaining prisoners. The price was reportedly 62 blankets, 62 cotton shirts, 12 Hudson Bay rifles, 22 handkerchiefs, 300 loads of ammunition, and 15 fathoms of tobacco. In 1850, forces were sent from Central Oregon to seek justice against the Cayuse. In order to end the conflict, 5 members of the Cayuse tribe voluntarily turned themselves over to be tried for murder. The men argued that tribal law allowed them to kill a medicine man who gives bad medicine. This defense was not accepted, and the 5 men were found guilty and hanged. Tonquin's final words were reportedly, "Did not your missionaries teach us that Christ died to save his people? So we die to save our people." A court observer of the time wrote, quote, "We have read of heroes of all times. Never did we read of, or believe, that such heroism as these Indians exhibited could exist. They knew that to be accused was to be condemned, and that they would be executed in the civilized town of Oregon City." Around the same time, a growing number of settlers coming to Oregon, combined with the unsettled control between the British and the Americans, had led to confusion around how to resolve even simple legal matters. The death of a wealthy rancher named Ewing Young brought this question front and center as he died with neither a will nor an heir. The 3 main non-government entities in the area were the Hudson Bay Company, the Jesuit Catholic Church missionaries from Canada, and the Protestant Church missionaries from the East, and Young wasn't particularly connected to any of them. He was, however, connected to a lot of the other ranchers in the area who were quite interested in how his land, cattle, and wealth would be distributed. These growingly wealthy men assembled to create a provisional civil government, which would set up civil and criminal governance over the pioneers who were not connected to the Hudson Bay Company. These men tended to be American and inclined toward pushing the currently jointly controlled area to eventually become incorporated by the United States. By 1842, the debate they were having was around if they should create a separate country of Oregon, hoping to be eventually annexed by the United States, or simply maintain the status quo, with additional local governance increasing. In 1843, the desire to address issues around the dangers of wolves, cougars, and bears helped the group, quote, get an object before the people upon which all could unite. At the gathering, an agreement was made regarding the funding of bounties for these animals, and it was also agreed to create a governor of the area, and a vote was held on how to form a government generally. The Americans present at the meeting outvoted the French Canadians, who were more loyal or at least more connected to the Hudson Bay Company. Work began on writing the first Oregon legal structure rules. The group wrote the Organic Laws of Oregon, and the preamble made clear that this was a temporary government, quote, until such time as the United States of America extend their jurisdiction over us. The first section largely followed the structure of Congress's Northwest ordinances, only swapping out representatives of the people in places Congress had been referenced. It differs from the United States in partially banning slavery, stating, quote, there shall neither be slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Eliza White visited native groups throughout the Willamette Valley and introduced himself as being deputized to regulate tribal matters by the United States government. In 1843, a native man by the name of Cockstock became upset when one of his relatives was flogged by White for breaking into the home of a missionary. He began to argue openly that White and the government officials should have no authority over the native people in the area. Cockstock was employed by a biracial black man by the name of Winslow Anderson, and had been reportedly promised by Anderson a horse in payment for his labor. However, Anderson sold the horse that Cockstock believed he had been promised, along with farmland, to a free black settler by the name of James Sauls. Cockstock rode to Saul's farms in April of 1843, took the horse from Saul's, and threatened both Anderson and Saul's. Saul's wrote a letter to Eliza White seeking for assistance. He told White of the threats he had gotten from Cockstock, and wrote in the letter that Cockstock had, quote, murdered several Indians lately. There was an alternative account from a Catholic bishop that agreed that there had been a murder of a native man in the area, but the murder was a result of a man abusing two slaves and then retaliating. He stated that this did not involve Cockstock and that the two murderers had left the area to return to their homelands. But there were also rumors that in November Cockstock had gone to White's home, seeking to get revenge for his flogging of his relatives. So in February of 1844, White worked to assure a $100 bounty was put out for Cockstock. On hearing of the bounty, Cockstock came to Oregon City with several men, asking Winslow Anderson why a bounty was on his head. A crowd formed around the disruption, and reportedly as one white settler yelled out, "That Indian is a good man, you should not molest him. If you do, you will repent." A provisional government official by the name of George LeBreton quickly assembled a posse to find Cockstock and, quote, shoot him at any risk. A fight broke out, and Cockstock was killed by Anderson using the butt of Anderson's rifle, and LeBreton and one other white settler was killed. A local preacher wrote of the incident, quote, the settlers seem to acknowledge that they have been too quick in this unfortunate affair, but the unlucky deed is over. It is a true murder based upon the extremely rash and unjustifiable actions of poor LeBreton, who will pay dearly for his apostasy and crime. Native Americans were furious over Cockstock's death, and the potential instability would look bad for Elijah White in his role with the federal government. Likely in an effort to shift blame away from himself, White wrote back to Washington of the incident in a way that framed all of the blame around the free blacks. He wrote that James Saul's, quote, remains in that vicinity with his Indian wife and family, conducting as yet in a quiet manner, but doubtless ought to be transported together with every other Negro, being in our condition dangerous subjects. Until we have some further means of protection, their immigration ought to be prohibited. Can this be done? On June 26, 1844, the Oregon Provisional Legislative Body passed a law that banned even free blacks in the Oregon Territory. It stated, quote, that when any free Negro or mulatto shall have come to Oregon, he or she, as the case may be, if of the age of 18 or upward, shall remove from and leave the country within the terms of 2 years for males and 3 for females, from the passage of this act, and that if any free Negro or mulatto shall hereafter come to Oregon, if of the age aforesaid, he or she shall quit and leave the country within the term of 2 years for males and 3 for females, from his or her arrival in the county. It went on to state, quote, that if such free Negro or mulatto shall fail to quit the country, as required by this act, he or she may be arrested upon warrant issued by some justice of the peace, and if guilty upon trial before such justice, shall receive upon his bare back not less than 20 nor more than 39 stripes, to be inflicted by the constable of the proper county. And, quote, that if any free Negro or mulatto shall fail to quit the country within the term of 6 months after receiving such stripes, he or she again shall receive the same punishment once in every 6 months until he or she shall quit the country. Peter Burnett, who would later go on to be the first governor of California, wrote that the law, quote, reminds them of their inferiority, and that the free blacks remaining in the area was, quote, injurious to the dominant class itself, as such a degraded and practically defenseless condition offers so many temptations to tyrannical abuse. In March of 1845, President James Polk, in his inaugural address, stated that the United States' claim to the Oregon Territory was, quote, clear and unquestionable. His campaign had rejected prior proposal of dividing at the 49th parallel with provisions of the Columbia River and instead embraced the slogan, 54-40 or fight. Polk stated regarding negotiations with the British, quote, the only way to treat John Bull was to look him straight in the eye. If Congress faltered, John Bull would immediately become arrogant and more grasping in his demands. But Congress wasn't looking for a war, so negotiations were more flexible than the rhetoric. Future President James Buchanan negotiated with the British, and the line was drawn at the 49th parallel with the exception of Vancouver Island, which remained with the British, with all the residents in each area becoming citizens of either country. On August 14, 1848, Congress officially established the Oregon Territory. On September 21, 1849, the territorial legislature passed, quote, a bill to prevent Negroes or mulattoes from coming to or residing in Oregon. Section 1 of the bill stated, quote, be it enacted by the Legislative Assembly of the Territory of Oregon that it shall not be lawful for any Negro or mulatto to enter into or reside within the limits of this territory, providing that nothing in this act shall apply to any Negro or mulatto now resident in this territory, nor shall it apply to the offspring of any such as are residents. In defending the law to Congress, Oregon's congressional delegate said, quote, the Negroes associate with the Indians and intermarry, and if their free ingress is encouraged or allowed, there would be a relationship sprung up between them and the different tribes, and a mixed race would ensue inimical to the whites. and the Indians being led on by the Negro who was better acquainted with the customs, language, and manners of the whites than the Indian, these savages would become much more formidable than they otherwise would, and long and bloody wars would be the fruits of the commingling of the races. Although there was only one record of a person actually being expelled as a result of the wall, it still produced the intended outcome. The 1850 federal census reported less than 50 black or mixed-race people living in the Oregon Territory, at least one of whom had been previously forced to move north of the Columbia River by prior exclusion acts, but remained in the Oregon Territory within the outcome of the final treaty. In 1850, Congress passed the Oregon Donation Land Act, which granted 320 acres of land to unmarried men or 640 acres to married white couples as long as they remained on the land for at least 4 years. 7,437 land patents were granted as a result. For married couples, the land grant was divided between each, making this one of the first laws that allowed married women to have land under their own names. But it was only available to whites or whites who had some Native American ancestry, and all of this was once again not something agreed to by the native people of the area, particularly in the Rogue River Valley. Tension between Europeans and native groups in that area went back to 1927, when a Hudson Bay Company excursion led to the murder of an estimated 11 native people. A few years later, another expedition, led by Ewing Young, led to the death of another 2 Native Americans. Through the 1830s and 1840s, contact had been limited as Europeans tended to use the river as a passage rather than a place of settlement. But following the California gold rush, some miners hoped for similar luck in the Rogue River Valley, and with larger settlements in the area providing militia and declining native populations due to disease, they were more willing to press the issue. By 1852, 28 donation land claims were made in that specific area. In 1853, the same year that Oregon and what is now Washington State were divided into 2 separate areas, a treaty was negotiated establishing the first native reservation in the Pacific Northwest. Native leaders sold roughly 2,000 square miles to the United States in exchange for a reservation roughly 100 square miles just north of the Rogue River. The U.S. government also agreed to build Fort Lane to protect the natives from the encroachment of white settlers, but the treaty didn't solve the problem. On October 8, 1855, just 15 miles from Fort Lane, white vigilantes attacked a Native American encampment before dawn, killing at least 23 people, most of whom were women and children. A soldier stationed at Fort Lane wrote of the incident, quote, "During the summer and fall, ill-disposed whites have been threatening the Indians that belong to this reserve to commence a war of extermination upon them this fall, and many Indians have questioned me on the subject and wanted to know what they have done to incur such the displeasure of whites. I have invariably told them to pay no attention to what such men would tell them, that they were bad men and would not carry their threats into execution. But when the simultaneous attack was made on 3 camps on the morning of the 8th, the Indians must have been confirmed, in their own minds, that it was the intention of the whites to make good on their threats." Seeing that the soldiers of the fort either could not or would not protect them even on their own reservation, native groups retaliated by killing at least 18 white settlers and tried to move their people west to the areas where they felt they were more defensible. As they moved further downriver, they also attacked a mining camp, burning down most of the mining shacks and killing 4 more people. This violence between settlers and native people became more or less open conflict now known as the Rogue River Wars. And as the conflict escalated, troops from Fort Lane, initially tasked with protecting the natives from white settlers, now found themselves joining with the white militias to stop the Native Americans. The largest battle occurred on October 31st, called the Battle of Hungry Hill, where hundreds of soldiers and militia attacked a Native American encampment. The Native Americans were victorious in this instance, being able to hold off the attack and killing an estimated 36 attackers, while losing less than 20 of their own. But this was only a single victory, and by May of 1856, the native people of the area were starving, and seeing that defeat was inevitable, they were forced to surrender. About 1,400 Native Americans were sent to what was then called the Coast Indian Reservation. This reservation was originally a 120-mile strip of land over 1.1 million acres set aside for more than 25 tribal groups. But over time, the land was taken and sold to white settlers piece by piece, as Oregon's white population grew, generally in direct violation of previously negotiated treaties. Until today, the descendants of the 27 tribes that once controlled over 20 million acres from northern California to southern Washington now only own one 5.8 square mile area known as the Silas Reservation. In 1857, Oregon legislators were seeking statehood and wrote a provisional constitution as part of the process. Included in the Bill of Rights for the Constitution was the following, quote, "No free Negro or mulatto not residing in this state at the time of the adoption of the Constitution shall come to reside or be within this state or hold any real estate or make any contracts or maintain any suit therein, and the legislative assembly shall provide by penal laws for the removal by public officers of all such negroes and mulattoes, and for their effectual exclusion from the state, and for the punishment of persons who shall bring them into the state, or employ or harbor them. The Constitution also barred, quote, Negroes, mulattoes, and Chinamen from owning land in Oregon. When the question of racial separation was put to a public vote, it passed by a margin of 8,640 to 1,081. None of this prevented Oregon from being admitted to the Union on February 14, 1859. In 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, Oregon passed a law banning interracial marriage and placing an annual tax on blacks, Chinese, Hawaiians, and mulattoes. The passage of the 14th Amendment in 1866 technically invalidated some of these laws, but 2 years later, in 1868, the Oregon State Legislature voted in protest to rescind their previous ratification of the 14th Amendment. And despite the provisions in the Oregon Constitution no longer being legally enforceable, they were not removed from the Oregon Constitution. In 1898, former Oregon State Representative John McBride defended the actions by saying, quote, some believers in the doctrine of abstract human rights interpret this vote against the admission of free Negroes as an exhibition of prejudices which had prevailed against the African who was not a slave, but I have never so regarded it. It was largely an expression against any mingling of the white with any of the other races, and upon a theory that as we had yet no considerable representation of the other races in our midst, we should do nothing to encourage their introduction. We were building a new state on virgin ground. Its people believed it should encourage only the best elements to come to us and discourage others. In 1916, Oregonians voted to keep the section of the Constitution which read, no Negro, Chinaman, or mulatto shall have the right to suffrage, despite the 15th Amendment of the Constitution making it illegal. In 1926, when a repeal of the racial exclusion law was put on the ballot, it was able to pass, but more than 37% voted against removing the provision. Oregon didn't rescind the 1868 de-ratification of the 14th Amendment until 1973. History is awkward.